This series of the 50 Faces podcast is proudly brought to you by B Finance, a trusted partner to the world's leading institutional investors. With a proven track record in strategy, implementation, and oversight, B Finance delivers bespoke investment consultancy that empowers asset owners to achieve their unique objectives. Whether it's refining portfolio strategy, selecting fund managers, monitoring performance, or getting better value for money, B Finance combines global expertise with tailored solutions to unlock value for their clients. To learn more about how they've supported over 500 clients in 45 countries, managing assets totaling over $9 trillion, visit bfinance.com.
They sit on the junction of politics, macroeconomics, and finance. That's the nexus you want to be in. It's really interesting. The 12 largest sovereign wealth funds manage 90% of the assets of sovereign wealth funds.
I'm Aoife Devitt, and welcome to the 50 Faces podcast, a podcast committed to revealing the richness and diversity of the world of investment by focusing on its people and their stories. I'm joined today by Victoria Barbary, whose LinkedIn bio states that she helps sovereign wealth funds become better investors for the benefit of their citizens. She's Director of Strategy and Communications for the International Forum of Sovereign Wealth Funds and formerly worked in research roles relating to sovereign wealth funds. Welcome, Victoria. Thanks for joining me today.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you very much for having me.
Well, let's start by talking about your background, because you've had an interesting, quite indirect route into your current role, specializing in sovereign wealth funds. Can you walk us through where you started?
Yes, well, I started off doing a PhD in British history at the University of Cambridge, getting 2 years into my PhD and realizing for the first time that I didn't want to be an academic, which was a little bit of a surprise to me because I'd always thought as soon as I stepped foot in university that that's what I wanted to do. But ultimately, I was very lucky through the networks that I had generated at Cambridge. And I started off as an economic development consultant, working primarily in the Middle East. And that was in 2007, which is how I came across sovereign wealth funds, because as you will remember, that's the first time they really came into the headlines. And I was just asked to go away and find out everything we knew about sovereign wealth funds, because some of them were our clients. And I worked really extensively on that. And that's how I first came across them. But I did that job for nearly 5 years. And then for various reasons, I decided to cycle off that. And I really, as a researcher with a PhD, I always really enjoyed the research and the writing. So I worked for Institutional Investor. I started a new business for them called Sovereign Wealth Centre, which was a business that was essentially there to provide accurate, good information on sovereign wealth funds to the financial services and professional services industry. So that was a really exciting time in my life from 2012, building the business, really learning about how sovereign wealth funds work, building my networks. And then I took a little bit of time out after that, working for an asset management company, but really working with institutions and a wider range of institutional investors. But again, it all came back to sovereign wealth funds when I started my current role at the end in the third quarter of 2016. So that's nearly 9 years ago, which feels quite a long time. But we've really built IFSWF into a really important hub for our members, and now enabling them not only to have accreditation of their governance standards, but also exchange knowledge. And we also do quite a lot of, going back to my research background, of research which helps represent them accurately to a range of interested external stakeholders. And all of that research is primary research. So we survey our members very regularly. And that's a really important part of creating an accurate picture of what sovereign wealth funds do and their diversity and complexity as a community.
I always like to go back to people's roots in order to see what those roots taught you about the present role. Think about history and maybe diplomacy. That is a characteristic of some of the protagonists there, and the complexity, of course, of the concepts. Would you say that your understanding of history has helped in some of the diplomacy needed for this role?
Oh, I think so. I've always said that I don't think I've had a job that I could have done without my PhD, because it does teach you, from the fundamental skills of being able to analyze information, be able to create storylines, and just being really sensitive to all the different moving parts, because I did political history. And so you're always sitting there trying to work out how all these pieces work together. I'm a great believer that we need to, yes, I know there's the old saying that the past is a foreign country, but also that really we need to look at the past to understand the present. And although we're in a very challenging part of history at the moment, I think that actually, yes, I think that you do need to have the analytical skills that being a historian gave me on the one side, but also the understanding of people and narrative and how people understand the world, which is very much through stories. And really, one of the parts of my job that I do is really for the knowledge sharing program we do, for the research that we do, is use the information that we have and the accurate data that we have to create narratives that can really help readers or listeners understand how this world works. Because as humans, that's how we understand the world, is through narrative. So yes, I think history was a very important part of my training, actually.
And moving now to the International Forum of Sovereign Wealth Funds, which we will abbreviate as IFSWF, not to have such a mouthful there. Can you just give us the lie of the land, I suppose, around sovereign wealth funds today? Do you know how much they are in total? What's the range? Yeah, smallest to largest type of a general feel.
Yes, so we have a global membership. There are around about, well, from tomorrow it might be different, but we have about 100 sovereign wealth funds from around the world on every continent, apart from Antarctica, obviously. And as I said, I started interacting with sovereign wealth funds back in 2007 when you had two very distinctive types of sovereign wealth fund. You had what we would tend to call savings funds, which were either for intergenerational savings, future generation funds, which were funded by fiscal surpluses. And those might have been used for future generations. And then you have the Australians and New Zealand, where they have these long-term superannuation funds. But then there were also kind of short-term stabilization funds that were funded to either help defend a currency for a commodity-based economy, or a rainy day fund. So if there was a massive fall off or rest of spending need, that they could be used to help bolster the economy, which I think they were used around the world by governments during the pandemic very successfully. But since about 2010, 2011, we have seen the rise of what the World Bank has called strategic investment funds. And I think it's a good moniker, because what these funds are is they may not be from countries that have a fiscal surplus, but they are using them to invest for profit independently in their own economies for economic diversification and development. And they can do a range of things, whether it's investing in strategic sectors, attracting an FDI, developing local capital markets. And we see these being used around the world. I mean, I think from my perspective, Africa, particularly sub-Saharan Africa, is where this model has been most innovated around. But we've also got examples in India with the National Infrastructure Investment Fund, or with Indonesia, which is the Indonesia Investment Authority. And these funds are totally new. So when I started doing this, they didn't exist, but they're now almost half of our membership. So they're a really important part of the ecosystem now, not only because they're a way of states deploying capital for investment rather than spending, but also because they're really important partners for some of the big savings funds that want to invest in emerging markets, potentially in major projects. So what we see at the moment is a particular interest around renewable energy, around sustainable infrastructure, because those are going to generate long-term returns for those big funds. So they're really useful partners for other sovereign wealth funds, for other big investment companies. And I think that they provide a very valuable role of providing local knowledge and deal flow and de-risking, whether that's legally or politically, through those deals. And I think that they're going to be a very important player going forward. So that's the way that we've really seen the world of sovereign wealth funds evolve. But we almost must always realize that the kind of 12 largest sovereign wealth funds, I think it's 12, manage about 90% of the assets under management. So when we think about sovereign wealth funds as a group, you're actually, in terms of financial firepower, thinking about a very, very small group of investors. So maybe around about a dozen.
Fascinating. And then I suppose in light of that, I'd love to just go through some of the three aims of IFSWF one at a time: standard setting, knowledge sharing, and a representation. Yeah. Given this disparity, I suppose, in size, what does standard setting mean in this context?
So when we were formed in 2008 under the auspices of the IMF, the whole trigger for us being formed was the fact that suddenly these large off-balance sheet state-owned investors had started to emerge on the world stage, particularly in the light of the DP World purchase of P&O, which had some strategic port assets in the US, but also CNOOC, which is one of the big Chinese oil companies trying to take over Unocal, and that was 2006, 2007. And there was a concern in the US and in Europe that these big state-owned investors would be used to undermine the global financial system or would be used to further national political interests. And so they brought all our original 26 members together to write the generally accepted principles and practices for sovereign wealth fund governance, which are now known as the Santiago Principles. And these, I think, even back in that time, our founding membership was so broad that they had to be relatively flexible principles. And at the time, and I will put my hand up to have been a critic at the time, saying these are fluffy, they've got no teeth, how are these ever going to work? And actually, I think they have stood the test of time because they are flexible. So every 3 years, our full members have to do a self-assessment against the Santiago Principles. So we put the principles into a template and say, you have to explain how each of these principles is implemented. And that's all published on our website. So it provides real transparency into the governance practices, how they manage everything from their relationship to the government, through risk, through financial independence, through government independence, through financial motivation. You know, a lot of our members will disclose their sustainability and responsible investment practices through those. So they give a really good overview of how these funds are managed and governed. And that's kind of like the absolute bedrock of what we do. And I think one of the important things that we've achieved is having this acceptance that this is an important thing for sovereign wealth funds to do for their own legitimacy for their citizens. So that's kind of the standard setting part of the piece. When it comes to knowledge sharing, I think that this was something that we always thought was going to be important, and it started just before I joined. But bringing our members together, and there is an obvious diversity across the membership, right? We have some of the largest investors in the world and some really small ones. But I think that they all have this commonality, that the fact that they are managing their government's money, their citizens' money, and there's a responsibility to that that is different from being another investor. There is a fiduciary duty that is important. And so being able to share some of the knowledge from the older, more experienced funds through to the younger, smaller funds from different geographies, I think is really important, because you don't need to reinvent the wheel every time you set up a sovereign wealth fund. I don't like the idea of templates, but a toolkit of best practice that you can knit together to manage your money in the way that works for your unique circumstances as a sovereign wealth fund, because obviously every country is different. And so what we do is a mixture of online and in-person events that enable presentations, enable people to network. And I think that that's a super important part. And we do this mostly, A, under the Chatham House rule, and B, it's pretty much closed door. But it provides a space where people feel relaxed and comfortable enough to share information that they maybe wouldn't want to do in other circumstances. So it's a necessary space that I'm very proud that we've really developed. And it's probably one of the very few good things that came out of the pandemic, is we can now do a lot more online than we used to be able to. And then finally, the representation piece, as I said, going back to my background as a researcher, being able to do primary research with sovereign wealth funds, interview them, survey them, and tell their story is really attractive, because traditionally, and I'm very well aware of this, that sovereign wealth funds weren't the most transparent investors in the world. Over the last 15 years or so, we've seen a huge improvement in transparency. But the fact that we can now, whether it's on climate, whether it's on investment practices, whether it's on, we've done an awful lot of research from impact reporting, the way that they think about how they invest in the global economy. All of these things are really valuable to people who work with them, because otherwise they're kind of reliant on headlines in the FT and the Wall Street Journal. And I think that actually us being able to say, you can come to our website, we've got this research that is going to tell you how sovereign wealth funds are really thinking about the world, is super important. And I'm afraid we don't get a lot of headlines because we're quite accurate in the way, or very low key in the way we describe things. But It is all there for people to see. And I think that the strategic partners for sovereign wealth funds, that's a really valuable resource to have. And I'm very proud of the fact we've built that up from absolutely nothing when I joined to, I think we do 4 or 5 reports a year now. So we do 3 kind of main pillars and then some ad hoc stuff. So the 3 main pillars are our annual review, our annual climate report, which we do in partnership with the One Planet Sovereign Wealth Fund Network. And then we do our investment flows piece, which we do in partnership with State Street.
Fantastic. And I think that ties to my next question around governance. So you said that the success of wealth funds hinges on robust governance and accountability. I'm sure every sovereign wealth fund has a different governance structure that suits their own nuances. But would you say there's any best practice in terms of governance and accountability that you can point to?
Yes. So, I mean, if you've met one sovereign wealth fund, you've met one sovereign wealth fund. It's very difficult to generalize across the piece. But I think that if you kind of boil the Santiago principles down to their real bare bones, I think that the most important thing about a sovereign wealth fund is that its decision making is independent of government. So that the executive team and the investment committee, they are not influenced by the government executive or legislature at all. And I think that that's really important because otherwise you end up with decisions being made on a non-financial level, which leads me to the other really important part of the Santiago principles, which is that they are financially motivated. They're there to make money. There are development banks, there are development institutions, there's grant makers. And I think quite often governments globally are very confused between spending and investment. I'm always quite interested when governments say, oh, we're investing in by giving grants. And you're like, no, that's not an investment. That's not going to get you any money back. I see what you mean, but that's government spending. That's what government spending does. Sovereign wealth funds are there to make a commercial return for the government that can then be reinvested. And I think that those 2 things are the most important things. And that's what differentiates a sovereign wealth fund from any other government linked entity. In fairness, I think that at the moment we're at a really interesting time where, especially if you look at places like Abu Dhabi, where you've got quite a few what I would call sovereign wealth fund adjacent investors that are not sovereign wealth funds, but they are like those. They've got specific remits, maybe that you can see that they're slightly different, but actually they're really good partners for a traditional sovereign wealth fund. So this is going to change. And I mean, in the time that I've been working in this space, sovereign wealth funds have evolved. I think we have to be really flexible and really inclusive because good governance is essential. It makes better decisions. It makes more money for citizens. It's the right thing to do. And I think also, and this is something that I've noticed, and particularly since the pandemic, is that in a world where people have access to so much information and so much data, it's really important to have clear governance and transparency around sovereign wealth funds because that's what citizens want. And it doesn't matter where in the world you are, people will, now they have access to loads of information. It's becoming more important to be able to play that game. And I think that's something that's really interesting about the current environment. So we've got this kind of rise of quasi-sovereign wealth funds, and then we've got this kind of drive towards transparency. So those are the real trends that I see at the minute. But yeah, I mean, the best practice is independence of government, financial motivation, and transparency. So those are the kind of 3 main topics that the Santiago principles kind of really dig into.
Really fascinating. And then I've got 2 topics I'd like to address together. One is around sustainability and the embrace of the climate agenda, because I know that you survey members on that. And then this topic of regenerative capitalism, which is a little bit tied, I suppose, to sustainability, has come up. Any trends or examples that you can speak to on those topics?
So we first started surveying our members on climate change and their practices around climate change in 2020. And I would love to say there was a big plan around this, but it was simply to keep me from being very bored during the lockdowns. And we'd had quite a lot of inquiries as to people not knowing what sovereign wealth funds were doing towards climate change. And I was like, because obviously during that lockdown in 2020, that it suddenly picked up on the agenda. And what we've seen over the past 5 years is a real embracing of climate change as an investment theme, but also a change from understanding that they think they should implement climate change principles in their investment policy because it's the right thing to do, which was what we were seeing in 2020, to really, in our current report, which will be out hopefully in the next week or so, is that they really understand that it's going to affect their bottom line over the long term. So we've seen a really fundamental change in the way they think about it. So climate change, it's not an ethical consideration. It's actually a financial one that I think was really hit home in 2020. And that's continued, whether it's the forest fires in LA recently, whether it's been, the huge typhoons in East Africa. And I think that that's been really important in helping them understand the nature of physical climate risk. So really taking that into consideration has really changed. And because of that, that's driven much more implementation and integration throughout the portfolio. So I think that what we've been doing since the end of lockdown is we have an annual sustainability workshop where we allow all our members to discuss that integration process and how it works and the challenges they're having. And I think that that's been super important. Over the past 12 months, I think we've seen a challenge around reporting. And that's on two ways, really. I think the first is simply that with increased scrutiny of environmental issues, sovereign wealth funds are less likely to talk about generalities and much more about specifics, which means they're preferring to talk about these issues less. That doesn't mean they're not doing less, because we can see massive progress. It's just the reporting of them needs to be really detailed and really accurate. And as we all know, data is a real challenge, and it continues to be the most things that our members struggle with when it comes to climate is how do we get good data, analyzing good data and finding good people. So I think that while we may hear a little bit less about it in 2024 and 2025, that is definitely not an indication that they're doing less. And again, we're doing a report this year on social impact metrics as well. So we've still got that survey open for another couple of days. So I don't know what the results will look like, but I don't think any of the 24 institutions that have responded to that survey have told us that they don't think about social impact. It's more challenging than climate because it's less obvious how you deal with these things. But I think that that's also an increasingly important part. And although the language we use around this is changing, whether it is sustainability or responsible investment, it's all very much pulling in one direction, it seems to be, from our membership's perspective.
And social impact and regenerative capitalism, that would be the same thing there.
Yeah, I think looking at things like the UN SDGs, how are we thinking about those? How are we thinking around the impact that we're having, particularly for strategic investment funds? How are we measuring and monitoring the social impact that we're having alongside the economic impact that we're having? And I think that the SDGs are an increasingly important part of that, even though that's not what they were necessarily written for. But that's how they've evolved in the way that some of the investors that we're looking at. We did a report on that in 2022, which is on our website, but we will have a follow-up to that in May when we've finished this research project, which I think will be really interesting to see how that's evolved over the past 3 years.
I have some reflection questions just to conclude here. So when you look back at your journey from history PhD to your current role at IFSWF and all the travel you do and all the groups you meet, have there been any highs or lows of that journey so far that you can talk to?
Yeah, I definitely think there have been two real peaks. I think the first one was finally launching Sovereign Wealth Centre for II. I had built a business from scratch, which I had never thought of myself as being an entrepreneur coming out of a history PhD. It wasn't something that I expected, but I discovered that I do like building things. I do like building new organizations, new businesses, and I love that challenge. And I think that was it's incredibly nerve-wracking, but I really enjoyed that. And then I think the second real peak for me was our 2024 annual meeting in Muscat. It was the largest gathering of sovereign wealth funds in history. We had 46 CEOs there, 50 sovereign wealth funds represented, 275 people, which when I started, we used to have 90 people at an annual meeting. So it's really, really grown. And although I don't think anybody who sees me at an annual meeting thinks I'm enjoying myself because I'm running around like a mad person, I think I was amazingly proud of that. And our hosts at the Oman Investment Authority did an awesome job as well. But it's been an absolute privilege to work at IFSWF and to build a community. And when I see my members in a room together, talking, sharing, I kind of think that all the hard work is worth it. So I think those are the two kind of highlights of my career. I think in terms of the low points, I think that I work too hard and I can't. I always say I should, I used to be very good at saying no, but when you work in a small team, you become less good at saying no because things have to get done. And so I think I've had a few times when I've just worked too hard, and I don't recommend that. Don't do it. Don't do it, people at home. It's not worth the time. But you have to be able to look after yourself. And that's what that's taught me, is looking after yourself is important because you can't perform if you're not well. But also, I think being yourself is kind of a really important part, especially as a woman in a very male-dominated business. Just being yourself and being really relaxed has been something that it took me until my mid-30s to be able to do. But I think it's really helped me at IFSWF to rally the troops and create a community because I can be more relaxed and I'm not worried about what other people think, but you can just get stuff done. So I think that those are kind of lessons and definitely high points and low points.
Well, some great wisdom there. And we've actually been lucky enough on this podcast to host a number of sovereign wealth fund luminaries, such as Uche Orchi and Eugene O'Callaghan, as well as Abdiel Santiago, just recently in the first series of 25. And just looking whether it's across the sovereign wealth universe or not, any key people that had an influence on you throughout your career?
So I think none of this would have been possible without Sir Richard Dearlove, the former head of MI6, who is the master of my college at Cambridge when I was there, and he got me started on my road as a consultant. I think he was a really important mentor to me. I've been really lucky to work with some really amazing people who have just been ears. So Georgina Carnegie helped me when I was in my late 20s and early 30s, just really mentoring me through some difficult times of transition. Hendrik du Toit from 91 has also been a really great sponsor to me. I mean, he's really helped me. I used to work for 91 in its previous guise. And he's been really supportive of the work that I've done and been very helpful. And in his new role at GFANS, really helped with the sustainability, going back to the sustainability agenda. And then I suppose my last kind of thank you is to Adrian Orr, who's just resigned as the Reserve Bank Governor of New Zealand, but he was our chair at IFSWF when I first arrived, and he really drove me forward and allowed us to do what we've done at IFSWF. So definitely he's been a great inspiration to the whole team at IFSWF throughout the last 9 years.
Well, thank you for the shout out to 91, as we actually have had many of their professionals on this podcast, and they did sponsor us last year. So great to mention that. And my last question is around any creed or motto. So we've already taken that wonderful wisdom about looking after yourself, being true to yourself, being yourself. Anything you can leave us with in terms of a gem of wisdom, something you wish you had known sooner?
Oh, something I wish I'd known sooner. I've always believed that every type of knowledge is interesting as long as it's explained well. And I think that being open-minded around what you think you're interested in or what you think you're good at, because my experience is that, I thought I was a researcher and I'm not really a researcher anymore, but I think you put these barriers in your head that things you think you can and can't do, and actually they're not real. None of it's real. You just have to really be open-minded and go, well, maybe I can do this. Maybe this is something that I can achieve. And I think if you want a kind of real nugget, it's don't look at the problem, look for the solution. So that's kind of one of the things that I live by.
I love that. Well, thank you so much. This has been quite an empowering conversation, Victoria. I think the might of sovereign wealth funds is legendary, and it's only getting larger and more relevant. And having an organization like IFSWF to give that network to bring the knowledge to a higher standard and to ensure that standards are best practice, I think is so important, not only for the administrators of those funds themselves, but most importantly for the beneficiaries throughout the world. And thank you for the hard work you're doing to ensure that these standards are set and met, and for coming here to share your insights with us.
Thank you very much, Aoife. It's been an absolute pleasure to talk to you.
I'm Aoife Devitt. Thank you for listening to the 50 Faces podcast. If you liked what you heard and would like to tune in to hear more inspiring investors and their personal journeys, please subscribe on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be construed as investment advice, and all views are personal and should not be attributed to the organisations and affiliations of the host or any guest.